A very warm welcome, despite the sudden snowfall outside, to this year's Elena Maria Gorison lecture, which will be given by our artist in residence this semester, Ran Ortner. And he will be introduced by Hubertus von Ameluxen. He was a founding director and professor at the International School for New Media in Lübeck. Additionally, he is Senior Visiting Curator for Photography and New Media at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. Very privileged to have you here, especially after a long flight. You're rosy and heroic, so which is always a virtue. As always, the talk will be followed by a question and answer period. Please wait until you receive a microphone that will be brought to you, and tell us very briefly who you are, for the benefit not only of those in the room, but for those who will watch on the video. So again, welcome, and Hubertus.
So good evening, and thank you for mentioning my 10. It's in the ruins of Mexico, outside the city of ruins. Yesterday, in fact, all this 10 came from. It's very, and the way back now here to this evening, and I'm very happy to be here, to speak a little bit, just to introduce Ran Ortner's work, of which I know something, was above the clouds. So I just arrived, and those clouds and those oceans by Ran Ortner, they do have something in common. And this is, I discovered his work, and it is one of those extraordinary singular works which are driven by obsession. And this obsession, which is beyond everything else, because it is absolutely the urgency of existence, Ran Ortner has gone through it, and he's all within it, to enable oneself and only oneself to express something. And if you, normally we would all say, you start the work of art. If you think of a work of art, exactly there. For Ran, he will speak about this himself, it has been a way to come there. And this way was led, I think, as far as I understood it, and as far as I could see it by the works I was able to see, was led by the idea of gravity, non-gravity, equilibrium out of the equilibrium. So of the idea how elements come together in the beginning, in the end, and how every end comes to a new beginning. This is not circular, but it means that every ending leads to a new beginning. This is why, and this is really not for the art market, although it has to be, in some way it has to be exhibited, he takes such a long time, years, to do his works. But it means for his work, and I'm speaking specifically the works, and mostly those I've been privileged to see here in the studio, although it's not finished. Those are the ocean works. And when I said waves, and I mentioned Virginia Woolf, he said, well, not exactly waves, it's more the ocean. So it is both, because it's the ocean with the idea of an infinite horizon, and it is the wave with the idea of the finitude. The finitude, how do you say it? The finite, okay. The finite of the horizon. This is that all this finite leads you to the idea of the infinitude, but you need both. And in his works, which is extraordinary, and I'm not going to compare to anybody, anything else, I don't think even I could. I know that once one of your paintings were exhibited with the famous wave by Courbet. This is some time ago. I mean, Courbet is some time ago. But it is not that, because this way of touching the canvas, of going back and forth, is a way of measuring his own existence, and of course with his own way and with a brush and painting to measure the existence of mankind. So it is, I think, a rare, very rare privilege to have you here and talk about your work, and knowing that we are seeing now reproductions. And as somebody mentioned during the dinner, if you see the reproduction, you think they are photographs. Of course they are not. But if you see them, it is like here and there, the comparison. I must name one artist, but by naming this artist, I think you can measure as well where I think his art is. This is Gerhard Richter. Richter in the 60s made works, both, of course, his painterly works, and then he published a series of photographs of details. And then you see the details and you see this struggling with the paint and with the brush. And this struggle, this enormous struggle, which is how do you say this in English? A maelstrom. It's a maelstrom. It's the maelstrom itself of creation. This is the work of Ortner.
I don't really need to say anything. That was fantastic. It is and has been so incredible to be here. I have never had this kind of opportunity. I've never spent my time in an institutional environment. And so to the institution, to the American Academy in Berlin, wow, thank you so much. It's been, for me, a kind of unusual life of the mind, because I've lived a life of a great deal of solitude, which is something very different to isolation. Solitude is a kind of luxury. But my childhood was in Alaska, and I had these, as an environment that was kind of anti-education, anti-establishment. My parents were kind of, escapists, were really living on the fringe. And so to find myself in this kind of, this richness of thought and all of this is amazing. This evening I'm going to start you off with a quick video that will kind of give you just a little bit of a visual and an insight into some of the things that I find compelling.
In my work, I find the ocean, or water in general, such a beautiful area in which to contemplate because it's so foreboding and at the same time so utterly delicate. It's really something I reach for in my work, is I'm trying to do something that feels awful. Because life is awful. Everything that you know and love is in a process of passing. It couldn't be more nightmarish. And at the same time, it could not be more exquisite. The fact that it happens at all, this thing called life, is an utter bounty. We so much want to be so much more than we are, But art is not a cleverness contest. It is not one's capacity to be inventive. It is really an honesty contest, the capacity to truly be that thing that you are. What honesty requires is the courage to be incredibly vulnerable, which means you've got to be so strong. So the strength is used to open. The strength is used as a vehicle to get you to softness. So how can you be so strong to get so soft? The combination of ingredients is an impossibility. But this is about the rhythm of these things. When the rhythm is achieved, it is transcendent.
I'm always fascinated when I go into a museum, and I want to know the person behind the work. I want to know what compelled, what drove that individual to reach, to push, to struggle. And in my constant musings on creativity, and so much of what your observations brought to mind was this sense, there's this Zulu warrior chant before war is encountered, that whether that life is a struggle, whether we win or whether we lose, this is in the hands of the gods. So let us celebrate the struggle. So I think to your point of art being a struggle, if there was ever a moment, I find that quite extraordinary, the way we decide, for each of us, we decide where we put our stake in the ground, what field we decide that here I die, here I pour my life into it. This is where I exhaust myself and give the fullness of who I am. So I'm going to start you with the personal story of my childhood and how I came to this place. So when I was very young, I was 5 years old, my father decided that it was time for us to go to Alaska. We were living in a small town just south of San Francisco in California, and it was a place where Mavericks, that very famous surf break, is these big, heavy, booming, cold winter swells, and this extraordinary smell of eucalyptus in the air. And I remember this was the 60s, and I can remember these surfers, the surfboard technology and the wetsuit technology was these arcane kind of heavy, brittle wetsuits that functioned not very well at all. And these men would come out of the water with their stringy hair and knots on their legs where they had calcium deposits, because at that time they would kneel on boards that were quite large and paddle out into this. And I just couldn't imagine what compelled them. And from this environment, it's off to Alaska. My father had his pilot's license for a day. We leave from the small airport at Half Moon Bay, and we have binoculars to navigate so that we can read road signs. He's fairly early in his experience as a pilot. And we make our way. And we go to Alaska, and for $500, we buy 15 acres of land. And for, I think it was like 250, something like this, enough logs to build a log cabin. And we have a small landing strip beside our cabin. My father flies to work every day. This moment and these moments were extraordinarily beautiful. We would run out of fuel, and we would land somewhere in the Yukon Territory and pull into a gas station off the gravel road that was the Alpine Highway at that point and fill up with car gas. And I was living this reality that was alternatively exquisitely beautiful and terrifying. My mom had all three of us by the time she was 21, and so we were in this together, young, naive, and dominated by a brutal man that serendipitously was exposing us to extraordinary beauty. To cope with my pressures and the intensity of the environment, I was traumatized because of the severity of the kind of childhood I was leading and from my earliest experiences. And so then it becomes very interesting, this living the life of trauma, because it's, you're actually at home in this heightened circumstance, in this elevated state. You are living a rhythm that's the rhythm that you know, that is all of the entirety of your reality, is this kind of hyper-vigilant, ultra-aware, on guard, always scanning for where danger would come from. And danger in that environment came from everywhere all the time. I had a release. I had an extraordinary gift that was my bicycle. And by the age of 2, I was very fluent on a bicycle. And by the time I was 16, I was like those young Romanian girls you see on uneven parallel bars in the Olympics. And so this was my flight, these rhythms and this kind of cadence. And here I discovered something quite extraordinary. I found an altered reality. I found singular experience. I started noting my experience. I realized that I lived in the present moment, which is this kind of now, but that now was always informed by my future expectation and my experience of the past. So both of these things constantly feeding in to this center axis of the now. But something miraculously happened when I added speed. speed, acceleration. As you move like this, all of a sudden that future that's out there, it's not out there anymore. It's right here. You feel all of a sudden this connection between the now and the future. And the future is in this accelerated state of begetting itself, in this process of becoming in a way that allows no room for language. Your past and the injuries and the complaints and the exhilarations and all the complexity of that past seem forever ago. There is not room in this kind of heightened processing for a past. The only past that can serve you at this point is the wisdom of the body of those countless hours of training to become as proficient as you are in that thing that you're doing. I have a problem. And I shared it with you all with my the introduction that we all had our 3-minute talks. And that is I was Icarus. I was flying too close to the sun. My wings melted and I was in the hospital. And I was in the hospital again and again and again. And at the end, at the ripe old age of 21, it was not recoverable. I had a series of knee operations that would not allow me to operate on this, at this level that was always my ambition. And so then I had, it was time for a shift. I had to find another forum, another way of functioning. And my idea was art. Is there a possibility here? I intuited that it wasn't the motorcycle having the experience. It wasn't my surfboard having the experience. I was having that experience. If it was possible to have that experience in these accelerated states, surely a Buddhist monk would suggest that one could sit and be open to reality. And so then the question was, well, how do I even begin? I have parents who are in such a circumstance where there's no opportunity for education. So I have to begin to look at this. And so the first thing I decide to do is look up the word art. It might be a good idea to know what it means if that's what I'm thinking I might want to do. And that's interesting because the etymology of the word, it's a Latin word. And it's amazing that most of us actually don't know what it means, but the underpinnings of the word comes from the notion of arm, which is suggesting upper and lower. So this is interesting, the arm, upper and lower. And then this hinge, this bridge that joins. This is the holy and the profane, life, death. Art's about bridges. Art's about connection. As I continue the process, I realize, and I'm intuiting, that there's some other component I really need to be aware of, and that's creativity. How does creativity relate to art, and how does art relate to creativity? And I knew instantly, I just had a sense of this thing, that art was an idea, but that creativity itself was a kind of engine, and that this engine drove art. And so I had a racing background. And in racing, you need to have an exquisitely considered, beautifully tuned engine. So I realized I had a reading list on my hand. I need to accumulate the books that were kind of the foremost pieces of literature in the field of creativity. I need to check in with universities or whatever I could find that were doing kind of the most progressive work in this field and see what I could begin to learn. So it was a couple of year period of just delving deeply into the mechanisms of creativity and trying to get it an understanding of what that thing is. And this engine, this creative kind of mechanism is extraordinary. There's a variety of parts, but there are certain parts that are incredibly essential. And I'm going to just touch on a few of them. Number one, very fascinating thing is the question. And so is this notion of the question, how does the psyche respond to question? The psyche actually really collects around a central kind of mantra that's very simple and direct. The more direct you are with your question, the more the fullness and complexity of your psyche can gather to this central idea. In my reading, it was, Einstein that kind of quantified his question in a way that was so succinct. He made the comment that in his entire life, he was held by a single childish question. He says, all I was really ever interested in was, how does the cosmos work? I thought, wow, okay, I need a question. And that led me immediately to Rainer Maria Rilke, because I knew I didn't even have a frame for a question. And Rilke immediately connected with me in this notion that one is to live the question. And in living the question, you may find yourself one day living alongside of possible answers. So for me, the question was, what was the question? And that this piece is a child's block with the letter Y. Simply the most naive question there is. And you can see that the child's block is broken, but yet it's still whole. It's tethered together. Every idea I had ever had, anything that had ever been brought into my orbit, was corrupted by violence, by religious fanaticism, by narrowness, by smallness. And so I had to live the question of how I got to be who I was. And I realized that the first thing in the way of kind of the mechanized world, or the world of utility, that I confront as a child is the spoon. And each and every one of us has no choice as to how we're fed. Whether there's contempt on that spoon or whether it's kindness and generosity, we simply must eat. The only kind of primal wisdom we have is that wisdom in our body, which is our gag response. Otherwise, this driving need to ingest. It immediately took me to the idea of social conformity. Why do we set the table the way we set it? Why do we do what we do? The next moment I could see these spoons were all of a sudden it's the human figure and it's members of a choir. And I have a sense of this beautiful longing that one hears in choral works. In this piece, I was beginning to see the spoon as a sperm. I could see in this big piece of twisted metal I put on the canvas that this roughly was evoking a feeling of the double helix of DNA, this notion of life, and really this idea with this river of sperm, this idea of Goethe ends Faust with the eternal feminine draws us on, and this idea of this draw to this eventuality. The child's crib, spoon's too large, inappropriate. I thought I was going to be an issue artist. I thought this was kind of my cup of tea. This is where I was. And yet, something was going adrift. The work started to quiet and become more beautiful, more contemplative. This single spoon laying in repose, these large fields are simply sand that I've shaken onto a rabbit skin glue from a baking sieve. And so this powdery, soft surface, these surfaces felt to breathe. And the spoon laying in simple repose in connection with a larger, breathing, moving, living environment. As I continue to be fascinated with this notion of flow, of this fluid that is actually a solid that behaves as a fluid. And I was also seeing this notion of this V form of everything coming down and running through at a very specific now. But at the same time, this scattering and the kind of dynamic of flow that is the stuff of a kind of karmic to and fro in. In the randomness of that piece, I thought it would be fascinating to formalize it. So I took sand, and this is like a fashion catwalk. It's 25 feet long, maybe 5 feet wide, and a couple 1,000 pounds of sand. The back wall has a mirror. And the whole entire back wall is leaning in. And so what happens is the light is shining over your shoulder, is bleaching the sand out. And because this mirror happens to be a low iron mirror, so the glass has no green glass to it, it's crystal clear. So the second generation image of the reflection of the mirror actually has more impact than the sand that you can actually dip your hand into. This I was seeing constantly in these works, from the work I just showed you, That was very much the weather system that produces surf. In my lack of capacity to perform it on a motorcycle at the level I was able to, this kind of dance, surfing had begun to take a major role in my life, and I was seeing the motifs of surf again and again in this work. I could see this spilling and pouring, and I was able to work with fluid dynamics in a studio that in many ways mimics some of the movement of water. As I'm looking at the way that I'm getting movement in the work, I start thinking about what a critic wrote about Rilke. And he mentioned this idea that for Rilke, the only measure was the sheer act of the bending of the knee. And I had this idea of bending. And then I started bending, so my process actually becomes much more reductive. I start really living in this encounter as a minimalist. These were large sheets of steel, like an inch thick, very heavy, taller than the human figure, but bent about knee height, and very noble, would just lean back against the wall. And then I was bending other pieces. And in these big white pieces that were covered with marble-based white plaster, I was seeing that bend, but I kept getting another evocative feeling for water and the ocean in my experience on the surfboard. And I kept pushing back on this notion of the ocean and confronting the ocean as an artist. And then it occurred to me, I was reading and looking and searching, and I read a passage by Thomas Merton. And he made this point that there is nothing as old as human novelty, but there is nothing as new as that thing that is most ancient, always in the process of becoming. With this, I just felt incredible release. This ancient body of the sea that I'm so connected to through the practice of surfing, this thing that's kind of been my place to heal from my motorcycle experience, to begin to find myself and to have this beautiful rhythm in my life as I'm engaging art, there is a way to confront it. And so when I first started confronting the sea, I could see in it these extraordinary rhythms, and it felt to me like the rising of each wave was life, and in the end, this falling away, a kind of death. And I could feel it when I walked on the beach, this feeling of lament, the sea always in process of dissipating, of expiring. And then I saw the drawings of Victor Hugo. He would draw a picture of a wave crashing, with under it the words, "My destiny." Ah, this is how to die. This is how to die, to exhaust yourself, to spend yourself in a crashing glory. As I'm thinking about these notions, and I'm thinking about the symbol of the V that I had earlier, I realize that there's something else that's happening. And I realize that I'm drawn to the symphonic, and I'm fascinated with this idea of the sea, and if there's a way to bring the kind of muscularity and immediacy to break past the kitsch and the decorative pastoral that is so often seen in tourist paintings of the sea. And as I'm thinking about the here and now and the idea that it lives as this V, and that I had been moving it forward, I realized it was also moving across a center axis. That there was an opening, very much like an hourglass, where the sand falls through. And I'm seeing that this is a moment that is actually suggesting a kind of dynamism that is multidimensional. And it's a kind of dynamism that I was experiencing at peak moments on a surfboard and on a motorcycle. And the fact that I had time sweeping back in the last graphic that I built. This one, I'm just interested in that axis, and that central axis became fascinating for me because everything is split in duality. We're constantly in a process of things coalescing, then dispersing, connect to disconnect, loading to unload, being, non-being, life, death, past, present, in and out. But always we're connecting to this kind of set of opposites. And that we know we can't have an in-breath and an out-breath at the same time. But I know I'm experiencing kinds of simultaneity in heightened experience. I know in the sea I see simultaneity, in this symphonic everything happening all at once. And I realize that it's at the threshold in every moment that there is something occurring. And I realize this as I'm looking at the sea. The sea is self-similar and endlessly diverse. When you look at fire, it's self-similar and endlessly diverse. What's happening with these things that we're looking at that are self-similar and endlessly diverse? They're home to us. We recognize them immediately. They're foreign to us. The diversity is endless. So while we're secure in the notion of this I know, we're constantly being surprised. We're given a foundation, and then we're given a challenge. We're given a platform by which to be fully human, supported, and at the same time questioned and challenged. But I realized there was also another kind of threshold. And what I was amazed at in my experience on a motorcycle was that when I was close to near death, when I would be committed in a corner, when I knew if one thing went wrong, it would be over, it wasn't a kind of nihilistic play with some kind of sadistic compulsion. What was extraordinary in these moments was life insisting on itself. This degree to which the fullness of your being is rallied into, yes, this direction, this thing we do. Big wave surfing, exactly the same things. It's really interesting what happens, the difference between surfing small waves and big waves. All of a sudden, when you're surfing on a wave that can kill you, the degree to which you are recruiting aspects of yourself is astonishing. You feel this moment of this singularity, and you're experiencing this exhilarating insistence of life and this threat of death in the same time, this wedding of opposites. And I realized that in each moment, this idea of the self-similar, endlessly diverse, that happens in every single moment. Every moment that we're having, we know that we're having a moment. All of us collectively know we're having a moment. And they're similar. It's like, yeah, I know this. I've done moments before. And yet this moment is completely dissimilar to that last moment we had. It lives with an entirely different set of potentials than the one before. The insistence and the familiarity married to incredible complexity and possibility and potential. And I realized in this moment that the moment doesn't come in and out. There's no time. We're working at speed here because the moment, and I was reading this in philosophers, that life and death is the same thing. I'm like, are you kidding me? Have you been to a cemetery lately? Not much of a party. But then I see it, I can see it, that the moment is dying and it has to die fast because there's a new one coming, and it is coming like a freight train. There is an urgency, and it is driving insistence of now, more, now, more. And this requires the moment to constantly be exhausting itself and to be moving fully and confidently to death. That line, that horizon line, I realized was also the ocean. This is the line between one state of being and another state of being. This liquid, dancing symphonic, and then the lands. I also realized there's something here to intensity, and I realized that intensity was a key part of the creative process. Rollo May, the humanist behaviorist, said, sustained intensity equals ecstasy. What's he talking about? Sustained, all right, has something to do with grit, really staying, you have to go, duration, okay? Intensity equals ecstasy. Okay, there's this Christian tradition, seek and you will find. But the Buddha, there's actually a Zen saying that imports the notion of intensity. And it is, you have to seek as though your hair is on fire and you're looking for water. This is very different. This is another kind of seeking. What you've added is consequence. There's a relationship between consequence and intensity. And I also realize that as we live and have the courage to live in the immediacy of the moment, that it's a more intense way to live, that intensity quite gathers and reaches a kind of climatic exhaustion into death, and each fraction of a second happening all the time. There's a kind of climatic, it is Victor Hugo's wave crashing on the beach, but it is also Victor Hugo's crashing on the beach. And it is also the crash of sexual release, this idea of orgasm, and this notion of petite mort, that it is a mini death, that off of this excitement, death is produced. When I was first looking at the mechanisms at play in creativity, I came across a very disturbing piece of information, and that was that artists, this honesty contest. For me, this was really horrible news. Because as I was looking inside, I realized the only thing I could begin to count on was my ignorance, that I really didn't know. And I think that's really what compelled me into those spoon pieces, to try to begin to understand my ignorance. And so I continued with this kind of notion of living this question, and trying to understand the underpinnings of honesty and where they could begin to take me. The first paintings I did of the ocean were very much like this. I was interested in the idea of blood memory, these kind of hauntings. But then I came to this notion that I wanted to do things that had more of a muscularity and more immediacy, which took me into these next pieces, and that I was finding something extraordinary in detail. That detail, while it could very easily tether, it could very easily make something clotted. It's often, you can see paintings that are very detailed, and you can see this is the work of a weak ego, someone fragile that's attempting to bolster themselves through arduous labor. But I also realized there was a flip side, that each piece of detail was an opportunity to create a shadow and a highlight and a sense of atmosphere, and each piece of detail an opportunity to open, to open, to open. So if I could, with integrity, acknowledge each piece of detail, I could have a front to that little piece of detail and a back. And I really began to see more and more that there is no hierarchy. Where is the exquisite specific? Where is that moment, that center of interest? And I kept seeing it again and again in this notion of the symphonic accord that is everywhere, all the time. And so within that, I started seeing these kind of musical structures where, like a triptych, feels like opus 1, 2, and 3. I could see these melodic architectures moving all the way across, but then I could see within them all of these incredible moments within moments, worlds within worlds. This relationship with terror is fascinating. Rilke makes the point that beauty is the beginning of terror. And it really led me to this question: where do aesthetics come from? At what point in our evolution did we become aesthetically conscious? What's this role of beauty? And it becomes quite clear when you reflect that it comes immediately. The moment, as primitive hunter-gatherers, that you're foraging and you can't find anything to eat. You cannot find anything to sustain yourself. You're cold, you can't find shelter, everything is going wrong. And the next day, finding tons. You're warm, you're well fed, everything is going well. You're living a range of emotions that are connecting you directly to what is grotesque, ugly, terrible, what is beautiful, wonderful, elegant. And terror and beauty are connected in such a way that terror is asking us for skill. It's asking us for the capacity for nuance and for understanding. And it's doing so in a way that is counterintuitive. The notion of beauty taking our breath away. We know it's dangerous. It's already, the breath is shortening. And it is from our primitive experience with a knife that if you use this knife in a way that there's not skill, you soon come to terror, you come to injury. With fire, with all of these things, you're constantly put in this relationship between things working and things not working. And beauty connects us to this extraordinary richness of life and this amazing consequence. But consequence constantly asking us to import the fullness of our capacity in our skills and our attempt to engage in such a way where we say yes to the complexity, we say yes to the richness of the encounter, and we understand and take the tragic aspects of life as part of this most extraordinary opera, without trying to add a veneer of affectation that reduces life to a mere artificial facsimile. I'm going to finish by reading a passage from Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton is a wonderful monk, and I actually quite adore religion. I'm a devout atheist, and I actually feel that both Jesus and Buddha were atheists when I read so much of what they wrote. But also, when I'm reading Merton, I'm constantly replacing God with the notion of love. But this is this last passage that Thomas Merton leaves with us this evening. The more we persist in misunderstanding the phenomena of life, the more we analyze them out into strange finalities, in complex purposes of our own, the more we involve ourselves in sadness, absurdity, and despair. But it does not matter much, because no despair of ours can alter the reality of things or stain the joy of the cosmic dance, which is always there. Indeed, we are in the midst of it, and it is in the midst of us, for it beats in our very blood, whether we want it or not. Yet the fact remains that we are invited to forget ourselves on purpose, cast our awful solemnity to the winds, and join in the general dance. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Questions? Microphone, 1 sec.
I'm American, I'm loud enough as it is. But only half. You spoke of the duration of intensity equaling ecstasy. And the orgasm and petit mort.
Yeah.
Tracy Emin a few years ago at a very interesting Art Basel conversation said, well, do a fairly good Tracy Emin impression. Man, when he comes, he comes and it's over. But a woman, a woman, she can come and come and come and come. Good Tracy Emin. With all these sort of themes of speed, of danger, you referred to when you started doing the larger, sort of more detailed paintings of the ocean as being a more muscular expression.
Yeah.
How does your masculinity influence your work? Because these are all very masculine themes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I identified very strongly with my mother because my father was so brutal. And so I had a lot of disdain for masculine energy. But I've spent a lot of time looking at alchemy, and that's fascinating because there was a practice, a kind of a psychological projection of what science could be that happened for, I forget how many centuries on every continent. It was amazing. But you see again and again and again the image of the Hermaphrodites and this idea that someone who is whole is fully in touch with their capacities, the range of who they are. It was Walt Whitman that said, within each of us contain multitudes. I think it's very interesting the way he put that. He didn't say we are multitudes, because we contain them. And so I think this range that we have is quite extraordinary. And I think that the idea of sensuality and this idea of the dance, that it is, I think you can see the entire cosmos as one massive mating ritual. Attraction only happens because of the distance between things, but then that gravitational orbit, which things are close enough to where they have an accord and they're set up in dance and the music of the spheres and all of these things again and again. So I think the sensual frame is a very beautiful way of looking at this thing we call reality. It's expressed in everything we look at. Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Ren. Thank you. I'm Barbara Nagel. I'm one of the fellows.
You're my fellow.
Fellow. And you're not only an artist, you're a poet. What fascinates and leaves me perplexed about your paintings, I mean, many things. How is it possible? But it's also perspective. You know, how, and in a very literal sense, what is the technique? Are there pictures taken? You know, is this the perspective from a surfboard? But also, you know, if you go into the tradition of the Sublime, often the ocean comes in, but it's always with a caveat in Lucretius and Kant and Schiller that you're standing at the shore.
Yeah.
So from a safe distance.
Yeah.
You're looking at the scene, or even in William James, The Variety of Religious Experience, the idea is you stand at the shore,
right.
Safe distance, and then you can have this awareness that there is something that exceeds you. Yeah. It seems for you, you start at the point, yes, something exceeds me, but can you talk a bit about perspective?
Yeah.
Because it's so decentralized and disorienting, but I mean, great in that way.
Yeah. It's something that I've enjoyed considering. And I think it very much sets my work apart in the tradition of marine painting. There's no horizon. There is no rock. There's no land. There's no. It's only water. So it's immersion. We're fully in it, and there's. Technology and art has always had this fascinating relationship. Impressionistic painting did not happen until the paint tube was invented. Once you have this portability and take paint outside, all this thing is happening. It's interesting with all the realism that you see, and we all have such an understanding of paintings that have been painted in a very realistic way, still life's portraiture. You don't see it in marine painting because there was no way to hold the information to where you could draw it. So really, my painting would not have been possible pre-digital photography. And I say digital photography because I'm able to take thousands and thousands and thousands of photos of the sea. And so this is an extraordinary gift that I have, something that Turner most certainly would have liked to have had, is that capacity to import nature into the studio. And so I'm able to import this architecture in. And the notion of the Sublime, which is clearly what I was talking about with the idea of terror and beauty. But it's I think the notion of the Sublime, we can get distracted by the idea that it's this 19th century notion, but it's most certainly not. We're living it every moment. As a matter of fact, it can't live as a history. It can only live in the experience of the immediacy of this extraordinary thing called life. So I think the Sublime is now, and I think it's always now. I don't think it has an opportunity to be anything else but. And so this, there has been such a consideration of the sea. The first paintings of the sea was always peril. Everything was lost. It was fishermen simply didn't make their way back. But then as conquest happens, you see the horizon, it lights up all of that. By the time I arrive on the scene, that's all long gone. And what happens is, in the collective consciousness, the idea of the engagement with the sea is no longer conquest and this idea of reaching out. If you look at the surfboard, it really sucks as transportation. It's about a local experience, and it's about immersion. And I think that's quite fascinating, that idea of being in it and taking this notion of the individual experience. And it was one of the big things that I discovered in my learnings of creativity is that you have to proceed as a pioneer. And it's through the profoundly personal that heat is generated. And if you get to the depth of the possibilities in your personal, something expansive happens and you start to touch a collective personal. And so that's interesting for me, that notion of the personal, and then through it. And within each wave, each little ripple I see is this personal moment, this exquisite particular pearl, and yet this sea. I mean, this abundance is just so extraordinary. For as horrific as life is, the abundance meets it and kicks its ass in the end. Because what's happening, if you really stay and sit in contemplation with nihilism and rage, the only opportunity for it is non-being. Whether you kill one or a dozen, the only potential for anything is love, is eros. And you see it at work in and around this world we're living in constantly asking us to wake up. You?
Hi, so I'm Rand's girlfriend. Sorry about that. So my question is, I'd love to extend on Barbara's question a little bit and talk a little bit about the boundaries and limitations that you've set for yourself in the way that you've gone about executing your work. You speak about historically horizons, but we don't see horizons in your work. And why is that? And maybe you could expand on that concept a little bit.
I'm really interested in limits. Why does Shakespeare choose a sonnet style to write in? Why are these great Japanese poets choosing to write haikus? Why would you limit yourself like this? Louis Armstrong was asked in an interview, you're making a sound that no one's ever heard before. We call this genius. How do you pull that one off? And he goes, no. I don't do that. What I do is I honor my limits. And he said, how I approach my music is that I know my ensemble group intimately. I know them so very well. This deep personal of my intimate understanding of each of my musicians and where their strengths are and where they're not as strong. And I compose to and for them. So he's taking the suchness of the particular, and through the particular and the specific and the smallness of reality, then there's these moments that can happen where you transcend smallness. It's quite amazing that out of the individual, all of this. Yeah. Oh no, here we go.
No. It's just first a small commentary, because I understand now. I used in the beginning of the 90s. I was teaching for 1 year at the University of Santa Cruz in history of consciousness. And while giving a seminar on the so-called German identity, at the time where people were killed in Rostock in '92, my students were going surfing. So Santa Cruz, I don't know if you know about the campus in Santa Cruz. It's beautiful in California, and
particularly good waves.
And particular, well, I learned about this. Yep. I'm far too scared, but they were going surfing, and I thought always that this surfing, of course, there's a pleasure. Mm-hmm. There's death, of course. Yeah. I did never see it the way you just, of course, in your paintings, yes, but not in the surfing. Yeah. Because you think of going like the dolphins through the waves. Yeah. But you are on the waves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is just something which came up to my mind, because it is. I'm not sure if they had at that time this existential experience you are speaking about. Mm. Which is essentially, I think, linked, as you wonderfully showed, to acceleration. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you had it this time because there's a certain moment of acceleration, as you know, where the future and the moment are one. You made it already, almost. And on the other hand, and you spoke about it without mentioning him, is of course it is this notion of And this has to do with the less of horizon as well, the
Yeah.
missing horizon.
Yeah.
Or missing.
Yeah.
The horizon is there. Of course it's there.
Yeah.
This is the still point. So this is the Eliot's thinking still point. It's the still point. There the dance is.
Yes, without this.
So this is this moment, which in a way philosophically in the notions of sublime we had, yes, but they are, of course, it's historically, and we can today, the notion of sublime is you can't even seize it anymore because of the terror we have lived in the arts and outside of the arts of the 20th century. But this notion of still point.
Yes, the still point is everything. The still point, I paint stillness, but my paintings are on the cusp of movement. But I really am conscious to try to paint the underlying ground of stillness that action comes out of. And what's interesting about speed is it's the hub of Duchamp's wheel on the bicycle. This notion that the hub, you are in a place of stillness, that within this collision of opposites, or this passing through, there is the only way for the incredible dynamism is a kind of silent stillness. We all know the underlying ground of silence that music is being born out of, and stillness that action has come out of. But it's in these, this is really the notion of the Grail quest, right? That it is an empty vessel. This notion of emptiness is the most potent of all potentialities. Within this, anything is possible. So when you get, and it's really been suggested about Muhammad Ali and Wayne Gretzky, that they had a capacity to perceive time in such a way that they were living in a slowed time, where they had moments to response. There's actually been experiments that are verifying that this actually happens. I'm forgetting what the name of the person is that are doing these experiments, but people are falling free fall, not from bungee cords, but just into a massive safety net, but a huge drop, like 150 feet, something like this, into the safety net. They're given a massive clock, and the clock is reading digits faster than they can be read. And it's like they cannot determine what's happening here on this clock. And then they're put in a harness, they're falling backwards like this. They look at the clock, and then the harness is released and they free fall. And they can make the numbers out with the adrenaline charge. All of a sudden, there's the mind clicks into a different frequency and is able to capture those numbers. There's also we also know from experiments done with mice that mice that have been trained to measure 11 seconds precisely. Every 11 seconds, they get some food. If you put them on marijuana, they kind of just cruise around, and about 14, 15 seconds, they go up and nudge the damn thing, and they don't get anything. Then they put mice on cocaine, like 4 seconds in, and they're beep, 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 beep. So our experience of time is elastic. We live in this so what's interesting is this opens up the whole idea of fractals. What's happening here? And I think time is, we know that time is three-dimensional, and we know that and my sense is that it's probably a fractal to allow these worlds within worlds within worlds, and we just touch the cusp of that a little bit in our experience. But stillness, always, yeah.
Hi. I have a sort of to take that on a very different level. I'm curious with your experience with surfing, with motorcycle racing, in the creative process as an artist, working with this massive canvas. Do you achieve that moment where while you're working, or does it come? Does it come in the middle of the creative process, or this sort of thrust for the thrill of this drive?
Yeah, it's a great question. When and where and how do things come to a boil? When you make a mark with a paintbrush, the paintbrush is so low tech. You have a wood stick with some pig hair tied on the end. Bristle brush, we call this. And you have colored mud. It behaves like toothpaste. It's entirely uncooperative. And so you have goo and a stick with hair, and you make a mark. And you're like, well, that was special. Okay. You start the painting, and it's a blank canvas, and you have man, this is a masterpiece, just some assembly required. If we can just get these things right, you know? And then the moment you make a mark, you go from being captain to being a passenger. All of a sudden you have a problem. The problem is you've got this damn mark. And what is that about? And how are you going to make that work into something else, or is that it? And so then you add another mark, and you add another. And any single painting technique is very simple. But what's extraordinary is that after a while, you can't track what marks are happening where. At a certain point, things start operating in an accord. And I'm constantly working with a mirror in my pockets. And I take the mirror out and I look at the work backwards, and it flips it because my mind tends to freeze and says, oh, this is what this looks like, the conscious thinking. And so the eye is constantly needed to chase in the mind. So when I put the mirror up, it's pure eye. I no longer have a living concept in me of what it looks like. And I'll look and I'll go, oh, wow. And I can be in moments that are just, you know, working really late and look and go, it's so extraordinary. It's really amazing how that is possible, and I'm as baffled by it, you know. But I know that it comes through this process of just making marks and just considering and trying to bring as much integrity and consideration and just living that process. And then in the end, it's fascinating because it's a kind of meditation like counting beads. But at the end of the meditation, you bring something back from the descent, and then that is the painting. So you have evidence of what the nature of that contemplation was, and it's quite fascinating. Yeah.
Michael Giesen, and I'm not an intellectual, I'm a lawyer, and you will hear that I'm not an intellectual from the question. The question has two parts. One is just a small factual part, and that is for how long you showed us, you know, how you arrived at this subject matter. For how long have you been focusing on the ocean, and is that right now exclusively what you are painting? But the real question is, I would suggest that, you know, I don't know, 10 years down the road, you will be painting other things, if you're painting at all. Would you, you know, looking back at your process and the way you know yourself, would you expect this to be some sort of a gradual development that moves you somewhere else, or would you rather expect this to be a, you know, a sudden break or a flash or something?
Yeah, I really have no idea. I could have never predicted these periods of my work. So that's really fascinating. I feel like with this subject matter that I'm just beginning to cobble together a capacity to confront it. I really think that you know, the fact that it is so utterly universal, so much can be read into these kinds of rhythms. You know, it's the endless variety. That it is. Yeah, I have no idea. It's quite possible that I will never paint another thing or make anything else. That is a possibility. And there's also the possibility next week that I might go, another ocean painting? You kidding me? So who knows? But I just know now that I'm incredibly intoxicated. I feel you know, this notion of beginner's mind that, okay, now that I've learned this, what could we could make a real one this time, you know? So I'm constantly living with this kind of excitement. So I don't know when or where or how that finds a...
2005 you started in 2005.
Yeah, and I started in 2005 just focusing on the ocean. It's been since then that I've been really concentrating on it. Yeah.
Go to 50.
Yeah.
Hi, Ran.
Hi.
We met at a dinner party a few weeks ago, and you spoke very little during that evening. And yet you left an impression, a strong impression. Now, I cannot tell you how big the impression was tonight. And I truly want to thank you for your wonderful, interesting, and enlightening talk this evening. You made me at least feel like everything you said sounded so, oh yeah, you know, it sounded so right. and it sounded like I'd thought it before, but I hadn't. And you are really a very, very talented speaker, and I would like to thank you for this evening. Now, my question actually was very similar to the question the gentleman asked before me. It's, for me, everything you said feels like you've arrived somewhere with the waves, and where do you go from there on? But you have already answered that question, so I just want to thank you. It was lovely.
Very kind, thank you. Yeah.
Good evening, Catherine Fleming. My English is not so well, but actually I don't have any question. I would like to say, since the moment I stepped in, thank you. And I believe you are already a wise man, because since what I've seen, I didn't know anything about you before, and I was dying to come here. And everything you do, you go for, since the moment you start, has to do with waves, all your art. And I believe waves, it's all what we are. We are waves. The energy around us are waves. And it's not a painting. I think you reflect everything around you and yourself. And how higher we can come. I think you're a wise man, you are light. And thank you so much. Wow, you are my master artist now. Wow, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You talked about the cosmic dance and comparing eros and gravity. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, there's this question for us as human beings of, where did life first come from? And I guess, there's some evidence we still don't really know, but that certain chemical processes that it could come from, sort of material chemistry. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think about the difference between life and not life? Like, how,
Stephen Hawking makes a very interesting observation in this regard. The reach for this idea of the theory of everything, really a unified theory. And he says if we were able to really build and find the mathematical constructs for the perfect formula, would we still be missing that fire that's animating these formulas? Will there always be a gap? And it's possible there always will, there's a gap. The eye can't see itself. It's this incredible, instrument that's so effective, but there's nothing about it that's designed to see itself, So there's these kinds of folds that happen with consciousness. And we have, we have just made our way out of the cave. We've learned how to make fire and wipe our asses. We're still incredibly brutal and incredibly capable of very destructive things, and we have the potential even to destroy our very home. But what is extraordinary is that we have such moments of altruism and kindness and connection and tenderness that it's the potential there just lives and is so so incredibly rich. And I know as a kid I was really deeply moved by really cool dead people. So I would read Dickens and I'd be like, man, some enormously sensitive being has lived, And I think the way sensitives can leave something into this bin we call culture, and it's passed from generation to generation, we affect each other this way, is really amazing. Jonathan Salk, the gentleman that developed the polio vaccine, he said that we've moved past Darwin's model of survival of the fittest. We're in a new epoch because we're so self-conscious, and this is survival of the wisest. So that becomes very interesting, that we're self-consciously directing. And I think that consciousness, which is this thing we call life, is in the process of becoming. And now we're living a feedback loop because we are affecting our consciousness. We're also developing a hive mind through the internet. And that hive mind is particularly capable of fostering terrible malignancies, as we can see and have witnessed. But it's also capable of extraordinary problem solving and the upside potential is just amazing. So the question remains, about our future, but for all the noise that is, that we're always receiving, especially the way we have a very strong negative bias. It's blood that leads in any kind of news. We don't look at the larger news and really what's happening, the degree to which there is less starvation, the degree to which there isn't public torturings like there was in the Middle Ages. There is not, this idea of, if someone steals something, that they'll be mutilated for life. We actually are improving in collectively in many ways and growing towards living to support each other's well-being more and more. So it's really a fascinating drama that we're living in. We really don't know, and I think that mystery makes it just extraordinarily rich because it's just loaded with so much possibility.
Hello. So you've talked before about the detail in your paintings, and I'm assuming that finishing one painting can take anywhere from a couple of months to years, probably.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, when you're done with the painting, you're finished.
Yeah.
Is that a feeling? And then what kind of feeling? Is it a feeling of, I need to get this out of my sight, or is it a feeling of, all right, this is, beautiful, perfect now?
Yeah.
And when does that moment come for you?
I really love Beckett's idea to fail again, fail better. I keep reaching to make better quality failures. And I think that the potential of the next moment is always so rich and so compelling. I never actually finish my paintings. What happens is that there is a deadline, and I kind of have to go like crazy into this thing because I have this deadline, and it's always taken away being less than it could have been. But then I get an opportunity where oftentimes a painting will go out and be exhibited somewhere and then make its way back to my studio, and then I get to work on it for a couple more months. And then it will be exhibited again. And then it'll come back, and it'll be, so I feel like they're growing things, and I'm amazed at the degree to which a surface can actually gain experience. There's something that's explainable about the way the old masters worked, the way that they built in layers, and these layers are like a fretwork, again and again, more and more layers. And it's interesting the way that a signature can be read. It's like a lie detector test. It's who you are. You can't escape who you are. And so that there's some accord in the body of the painting and in your body and your physicality and in your movement. And it's always getting trapped within the fretwork of these paint layers. And it's quite amazing the way they hold this energy, but they can gain more experience. They gain weight, they gain gravitas, they gain nuance and subtlety. And it's really beautiful. It's the old ones are the beautiful ones, that they really gain something. But actually, it tends to be my preference in artists as well. I tend to like the roar of an old lion or lioness. I like great mature work, that people that are arrived after a lifetime of kind of being engaged in this process.